Steel, coal, gas, and oil, the building blocks of economic development. In this video, we explore the data trends of these components that are crucial for India's continued economic growth. We'll project India's future energy needs for when its GDP inevitably hits the $10 trillion mark, and find out why India desperately needs more natural gas. Energy is a foundational basis for all economic activity. If we examine India's GDP and manufacturing value added from 2005 to 2023, we can find a high correlation between economic growth and oil and coal consumption. India relies heavily on coal for its energy needs, with around 73% of electricity being generated from coal in 2024. This is significantly higher than China, which relies on coal for around 60% of its electricity generation. Coal consumption in India has increased by a factor of 2.4 since 2005, and 89% of that coal goes to power generation. India consumed around 1 billion metric tons of coal in 2023. Of that, only around 25% was imported. In contrast, India is highly dependent on imports for its oil and natural gas needs, with imports accounting for around 85% of India's oil and 45% of India's natural gas. If we examine regional trends for natural gas import dependence, we find that India is significantly more dependent on imports when compared with China, Thailand, Pakistan, and Malaysia. This dependency, however, could change if India increases exploration efforts in its large coastal sedimentary basins. This 3.4 million square kilometer area is still largely untapped, with only 10% of its area being under exploration for oil and gas resources. Offshore, India has 4 Category 2 and Category 3 basins that have the potential to hold up to 22 billion barrels of oil and a tremendous amount of natural gas, rivaling even the mighty Permian Basin of Texas. Despite its import dependency, India has benefited from the geopolitical climate since the start of the Ukrainian war. With Russian crude facing steep discounts, India has dramatically increased its dependence on Russian crude, increasing its imports 12-fold in the 2022 to 2023 fiscal year, and then even further, 56 times, in the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year when compared with pre-war import levels. If we take a look at the top oil and gas producers on a million terajoule basis, we find that India sits in 28th place, far behind the world's top producers, the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. China sits in 5th place, producing over 6 times more oil and gas when compared with India. To get a better feel for the connection between energy and economic growth, we'll explore India's energy trends in greater detail, including energy-intensive sectors like electricity generation, road building, and steel production. To power its economic growth, electricity generation in India has increased 3.4 times since 2002, with almost 3/4 of this electricity coming from coal. In 2024, only 1.9% of electricity in India came from oil and gas. For comparison, around 38% of U.S. electricity was derived from natural gas in 2024. With respect to environmental concerns, natural gas releases 50 to 60% less CO2 per unit of electricity generated and significantly less air pollutants when compared with coal. Around 3% of India's electricity comes from nuclear power, 9% from large-scale hydropower, and with another 14% coming from other renewable energy sources. As a result of low rainfall, reservoir levels have been low, leading to a dramatic reduction in hydropower capacity in 2023 and 2024, forcing an even greater reliance on coal. For the renewable sources of electricity, we find that solar power has found increased use in India, reaching 7.5% in 2024, generating nearly the same amount of electricity as large-scale hydropower does in India. Just as with Europe, India imports a large amount of solar cells from China, with China accounting for around 80 to 90% of India's solar imports. Despite the risk of over-reliance on Chinese imports, solar has provided a significant advantage in the electrification efforts made in the rural and underdeveloped areas of India. Natural gas plays a much smaller role in India's electricity generation, as mentioned before, with natural gas accounting for less than 2% of electricity. For natural gas, the consumption is split between the energy and non-energy sectors. If we examine the energy sector, we can see that the use of natural gas for power generation has actually decreased slightly since 2013. For this graph, we only show natural gas used for power, i.e. electricity, and for the general other energy category, which includes other energy needs related to manufacturing, industry, refining, and local distribution. If we look at the non-energy sector consumption of natural gas, which accounts for around 36% of natural gas consumption in India, we find that the bulk of the natural gas is used for the production of fertilizers and petrochemicals. If we dive into oil or petroleum consumption, we find that oil consumption is increased by a factor of 2.1 between 2005 and 2023. Almost 50% of this oil is used for transportation fuels such as diesel and petrol, or as we say in America, gas. Petroleum coke accounts for around 8% of petroleum consumption, with this fuel powering the energy-intensive production of steel as well as cement. Liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, composed of 3 or 4 carbon chain ultralight fractions from the crude refining process, accounts for around 11% of petroleum usage. LPG has found increased use as a cooking fuel and for lighting, especially in rural areas. Here we can see that LPG use is quickly displacing kerosene as a fuel. Bitumen, or asphalt, the non-volatile bottoms from the oil refining process, has seen increased consumption due to the development of India's vast road networks, increasing by a factor of 2.5 since 2005. If we plot bitumen consumption versus the length of India's paved road networks, we can find a strong correlation with an R-squared value of 0.85. As of 2024, India has the largest road network in the world, with around 68% of roads being paved. If we compare India's road network to the US, we find that they are nearly identical in terms of total length as well as in the proportion of roads that are paved. Only China surpasses India and the US with a total of 5.3 million kilometers of paved roads. And of course, these paved roads are host to transport trucks, cars, and motorbikes. We can see that diesel and petrol consumption have increased by a factor of 2.2 and 4.1 respectively since 2005. Consumption of petroleum coke, or pet coke, has increased by a factor of 3 to 4. Due to its high energy density and low cost, petroleum coke is used to power India's energy-intensive industrial processes like steel and cement production. If we examine the trend between petroleum coke and crude steel production, we can see that the relationship is somewhat nonlinear. This is due to the increased use of petroleum coke in cement manufacturing, offsetting the traditional fuel source of coal, which has become less cost competitive as India's demand for coal climbs ever higher. If we compare India's crude steel production with China, we find that China's growth rate for crude steel production is over 7 times higher than India, with a growth rate of 37 million tons per year compared with India's 5 million tons per year. China has come to dominate the global steel market. The mass production volume of Chinese steel firms places significant downward pressure on the rest of the global steel industry. In 2024, China accounted for 53% of global crude steel production, up from 31% in 2005. India currently produces the second largest amount of crude steel, however its production volume is almost 7 times lower than China. If we examine the percent change in crude steel production since 2005, India takes the top spot, having increased its steel production by 266%, when compared with China's 182%. This graph also illustrates the slow demise of the Japanese, German, and American steel industries. South Korea has stepped up its steel production significantly, increasing by 33%, while Iran, forced into radical self-reliance by Western sanctions, has steeply increased its steel production by 229%. Finally, we'll do a simple projection to anticipate India's future energy needs for when it inevitably hits a GDP of $10 trillion. In a past video, we did an analysis projecting India's future GDP. For the mid-level projection, we estimated that India's GDP would hit $10 trillion sometime around 2040. If you haven't seen this video and you'd like to check it out, I'll link it in the description. We'll use the projected GDP growth and then back calculate out the required electricity generation and coal consumption using the 2005 to 2023 linear regression for electricity and coal with respect to GDP. We'll assume that the relationship between electricity and coal consumption will hold constant into the future. We then arrive at a projected energy requirement of 4.7 million MUs of electricity and 2.3 billion metric tons of coal in order to accommodate a future India with a GDP of $10 trillion. In 2023, China already consumed 5 billion metric tons of coal, around 57% of global coal consumption. With China continuing to permit the equivalent of 2 coal-fired power plants a week, China's coal demands will likely continue to increase. This will likely put significant upward pressure on the future price of coal. And with respect to the environment, coal generates 2.3 times more CO2 and significantly more air pollutants per unit of electricity generated when compared with natural gas. The continued reliance of China, along with the growing India on coal, would be quite costly to the environment, while the growing demand for coal would chip away at its cost advantages. But thankfully, India is surrounded by largely unexplored sedimentary basins that could hold the answer: a greater degree of energy independence and the potential to switch to domestically sourced, cleaner burning natural gas for its growing power demands. Plus, vast amounts of oil and its derivatives, diesel, petrol, petroleum coke, and bitumen. Although switching to more renewable sources of energy like wind and solar would be ideal, it's a long shot to expect that India can sustainably power its economic growth solely with renewable energy technologies. If we assume that the bulk of that infrastructure, like solar, was imported from its northeastern neighbor, that would also chip away at its energy independence and self-reliance. Perhaps a solution closer to reality is that India could dramatically accelerate its efforts to extract oil and gas domestically and reduce its environmental footprint by slowly phasing out coal in favor of natural gas. Currently, India imports 85% of its oil and 45% of its gas, with natural gas being underutilized due to its over-reliance on coal. The oil and natural gas that India could find off its coast could then provide greater energy independence while also offering dramatic environmental benefits. We'll close by examining CO2 emissions for the year 2000 and the year 2023. Despite massive efforts and trillions of dollars invested in decarbonization, the US and the EU's reduction in CO2 emissions has been dwarfed by the increase in emissions by developing countries like India and China. Development requires energy, cheap energy, and it would be unfair to starve developing countries of the right to develop and improve the quality of life for their citizens. The EIA reports that 65% of the U.S.'s reduction in CO2 emissions is directly attributable to switching from coal to natural gas for power generation. If India can indeed find and extract the potentially vast reserves of oil and gas that lie off its coasts, it could follow the U.S.'s path towards greater energy independence and reduced emissions, while maintaining low energy prices and competitiveness. Natural gas may not be perfect, but it's better than coal. Despite the focus, attention, and obsession on renewable energy technologies, which are viewed as the ideal, care must be taken such that we don't make the perfect the enemy of the good.